Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program this evening. I'm sure it's going to be an exciting time. Good evening, sir. You're welcome to the program this evening.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator. It's always a pleasure to see you. And in anticipation, I'm also looking forward with pleasure to our listeners who have remained constant with us.
Yes, sir. Before we go into the program this evening, as we were preparing to go live here in the studio, my attention was called to the fact that we are on session 69. And I said, at this rate, it looks like we're going to reach session 80 before Prof turns 80. So, sir, how do you feel after 69 sessions?
I mean, did you really have to bring my age into this matter?
I did it.
Um,
I did it. I only said before you get there.
well, um, obviously, it's I've enjoyed myself. Um, this program has kept uh, the brain active and ticking uh, because of the rationale for the program, which when you approached me over a year ago about why you think we should have this program. Um, I had my doubts as to whether uh, we could sustain interests all around on your part, I mean, as the producer, on my part, and on the part of our listeners. Because with all my years of experience in this field, I knew within me that we that gap was there, not between falsehood and truth, no, but people have uh, people have biases without being aware of those biases. Um, Within us, there are inbuilt uh, biases which affect our narratives, depending on in which continent do you live, uh, what's the cultural environment, um, the educational milieu in which you grew up. Um, so, if you're an American and from the beginning, in your mother's milk is this American definition of democracy. Yes, one man, one vote sounds universal, but you then don't see the roadblocks within your own culture of that objective of one man, one vote. If you live in China and you are faced with the prospect of the difficulty about getting across to over 1 billion people who have the tendency to go different ways. one man, one vote will not be your immediate objective as to get people at least to face the same direction in terms of unity, in terms of law and order. If you live in Africa, where the difficulties of clean water, even 1 square meal a day, nations which are really multinational in character, uh, and who have just maybe 60 years of independence, not 60 years, 60 years of independence following colonial rule, which was never democratic. People don't seem to be aware of this, that colonial authorities were autocratic, on top of which were dictatorial governors who had the final say. One man, the colonial governor, had the final say. And then 60 years ago, bang, here you are, constitution, democracy. One man, one vote, majority must have the, and that culture is not inbred because, so against this background, you see things differently. An African government then is not likely to be emphasizing the kinds of things that are emphasized in Western culture. The Chinese people are likely to be more interested in cohesion. How do they achieve cohesion? How do you get 1 billion people to agree along one path? While the Americans, who gradually, or the British for that matter, gradually had built upon a foundation which was not democratic to start with, but over 100 years, they had gradually expanded, the basis of participation in their culture, and everybody had kind of been grown to sleep and face the same way. Their preoccupations will be different. So, to that extent, when you are then interpreting developments in the world, it's not a question of, to me, it's a question of American narrative versus European narrative versus Chinese narrative versus African narrative. But unfortunately, the media, partly for reasons of the economy, partly for reasons of uh, historical factors, global media is dominated by people with only one narrative. And that's why we then felt, fine, given my experience, and there must be several, of course, not must be, there are several African former foreign ministers who probably could sit in front of you and do this kind of thing that I am doing, who would then say, listen, preoccupation for Africa will not be on whether the different narratives that dominate the social media as well as the regular media, that it is this one we need to focus upon. And so when people are talking about a world order and they're emphasizing, uh, 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 marriage being between two men or two women, and she will say, look, in Africa, we want government to focus on providing clean water, providing, at least 2 square meals, not three, uh, and that kind of thing. And that is why we have this program to make sure that the African narrative or the African perspective comes into the narrative. That's why we are here every week.
Sir, I want to pick you up on a point you raised there. Um, there are other topics I want to pass across, but I will pass this based on something you've said. Now, given the colonial masters played a huge role in bringing democracy to Africa as we know it today, their way of government, and they instilled that. Do you foresee a time in future where African nations may choose to step away from democracy as a form of government as we know it today and do something completely different?
Yes, possibly. Uh, that's not to ignore the fact that most of the African government, African countries, over the past maybe 20 years have had uh, elections. They've gone through the process of having elections. These elections, were they free? Were they fair? What will be the credibility percentage? 75%, 65%? Well, but the important thing is the military had left us alone to have some form of elections. And even though we might grumble about um, the, 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 the credibility of those elections, we moved on. So we've had, but to say that Africa has finally settled into the groove of one man, one vote democracy, we will be deceiving ourselves. To say that the kind of democracy that we have delivered the goods in terms of economic and national development, we will be deceiving ourselves. To say that the kind of democracy that we are practicing has addressed the issue of corruption, we will be deceiving ourselves, because one country alone, Nigeria, has 600 billion dollars in terms of illicit financial outflows from one country. And those benefiting from that illicit financial outflows are both Nigerians and non-Nigerians. Foreign businesses doing business in Nigeria, as well as Western banks, where this outflow find domicile. I'm sure you've heard of the Pandora papers, which have shown there are no clean leaders all over the world, not just in Africa. So when they then look at China, how China from 60 years post, well, no, more than that, maybe 70, 75 years post Civil War chaos, and is on its way to becoming the number one global power in the world. And with a different, well, practicing a consensual form of governance rather than the Western, you know, government opposition first past the post style. When they remember the chaos that Russia descended into after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the attempt at practicing one man, one vote democracy. Not just African countries, I think a lot of countries in the low income and middle income countries may decide to give the consensual style of governance as practiced in China, maybe a choice. And there are one or two that are practicing that surreptitiously and that are being praised. And one of them is Rwanda. Rwanda goes through that process of one man, one vote, but it's more like to be one. What's the name of the president of Rwanda? Hmm. He
Kagame.
decides. Kagame. It's more likely to be one Kagame, one vote.
Sir, you mentioned Pandora's papers. I hope I'm not going to get into trouble tonight. But
Ah.
when I saw the papers, I looked at it and I was looking for some names there. When I did not find those names, I felt
Mm.
comfortable.
Thank you. I claim it. I claim it.
But there's still a lot of good news on the Africa front. About a week or so ago, Google announced that they were going to be investing about $1 billion in Nigeria and other African countries. And then again, last week, another major US company has announced $1 billion of investment in data centers in Johannesburg. Um, Sir, what is your take on this level of investment that is coming back, not just to Africa, to Nigeria, of course, as well? And what's your take on that?
On a theoretical level, and against the background of the hue and cry in the United States about Facebook, the congressional hearings about how Facebook is constitutes a danger to our youth globally because of the way and manner in which they run whatever it is. Um, I would be hesitant to embrace investments by uh, Google and whatever technological company you are referring to. I will be hesitant. I probably, I, I will hope that we are not going to get ourselves brainwashed. Because if the Americans, against if you recall, at the beginning of this present program, I talked about how from the beginning the Americans had managed to package and develop, politically and culturally, some values that are called American. And in fact, the kiss of death politically in America is to be accused of being anti-American. Um, you living in England, you will never hear of anti-British or anti-Welsh or that kind of thing. If even the United States can now be scared, and that's the word for it, that a whistleblower had to come out to say this is a danger to American values. Facebook is a danger to our democracy. It's a danger to our way of life. We in middle income countries and low income countries who don't have this solid foundation around which we could throw an anchor for safety against these huge giants. When they come bringing gifts, I hope they are not Greek gifts. You recall the saying, beware of Greeks, even when they bring gifts. So I will say, I will beware of these giants, even when they come investing. I will be, I will be aware, critically aware of it.
Thank you for that, sir. There's another point around Ethiopia that I'd like to get your views on. And this is the case where some UN officials have been accused of probably being a little bit too sympathetic with one of the sides in the attentions and the war going on between Ethiopia and the Tigray forces. Is the United Nations body here starting to lose neutrality in issues like this?
Well, I'm the one who is supposed to be the diplomat. You are the one now picking your words carefully and being kind towards the United Nations on this matter. You will recall that on this program, I had flagged some warring signs over the past 3 months, 4 months, when all of a sudden this huge global news media um, kept portraying the Tigray liberation movement as the gallant fighters against the bully um, in Ethiopia. I kept asking you and asking myself, which country in the world will tolerate a movement breaking into the armory of the central government, cutting away weapons, killing central soldiers, and simply fold its hands. And yet, the global media never saw anything wrong with this. Um, Two, when all of a sudden, this same, this same militia, the Tigray Liberation Movement, that had been portrayed to be at the mercy of, of the central government, all of a sudden came across with weapons and were now driving back forces of the central government. And this media, I'm not talking about where they were getting their weapons from. A militia does not take on the central government and start being victorious. Questions need to be asked. Thirdly, and that's usually the thing now. You start talking about starving children and starving women, and who's to be blamed? Oh, it's the central government that has put a blockade on aid going in. Is the objective of the world, of the United Nations, to stop the fighting, or is the objective to feed the people so that they are then strong enough? Because these days it's not only men who fight. In fact, the only ones who don't fight are the children. I have seen women fighters in the films of CNN and BBC and Al Jazeera. I've seen women fighters of the Tigray Liberation Movement. So is the objective to feed them so they are strong enough to carry guns and go and fight? And then, of course, the African journalist on CNN, who is usually pulled up. The moment you see her, you know this is disaster news for Africa. And of course, it is now, without evidence, by the way, this is Ethiopian forces, committing genocide. There are those key words that they use. When I listen to all of that, I said something is fishy here. Something is fishy here. There is bias against the Ethiopian central government. And in spite of the fact that that same government conducted the first, we must emphasize this, the first free election in the history of Ethiopia. Something the Tigray people, when they were in power in Addis Ababa, never did. And it was sufficiently acceptable that several African leaders showed up for the swearing in of the prime minister. All this global media are talking about was how could they have elections when a civil war was going on? How could they? I said something very, very fishy is going on. Then when the Ethiopian government, then about 3 weeks or so, or a month ago, expelled some UN staffers, I said, I knew it. They must have evidence. And now the evidence has come out in terms of this tape, which you made reference to in your introduction, leaked tape that showed even UN staffers complaining that some UN officials were showing bias towards the Tigray Liberation Movement objectives. This was not a conversation among Ethiopians. No, it was a conversation amongst UN officials who themselves were getting worried about the lack of objectivity and neutrality about UN officials. Everything then came together that this is what we have always suspected. Since we had no evidence, we will be told we don't know what we are talking about. Now, the evidence is that the evidence came out through Reuters, not through the Ethiopian agency. And this is what we've been talking about. So, really, I think the United Nations Secretary General needs to empanel a task force that will look at the guidelines prepared for officials who are going to go into these conflict areas and give them the blueprint of the behavior expected of them. But if only you listen to the global media, you will be able to tell. You don't need the CIA or the MI6 to come up with evidence for you. You will be able to tell where the bias, lies. But and let me finish with this: the UN itself needs to get its priorities right. Are the priorities to stop the fighting, or since they can't do that, you then hide under the flag of feeding people? To me, of course, the UN has had this conundrum even during the Nigerian Civil War and several other civil wars, where we'll feed people since we can't stop the fighting. What's the point of feeding people? If you feed people, unless you are going to say men and women will not be fed, only the children. Because if you feed the men and you feed the women and they are strong enough, they're going to carry guns and go off to fight. Is that what the objective of the United Nations should be? They've got to sort out this matter. If you cannot stop the fighting, leave them alone. In fact, you are probably kinder to them because the war will come to an end rather quickly than feeding people who are then strong enough to go and fight, and then you prolong the conflict, you prolong the fighting.
Thank you for that, sir. Let us go to Kenya and Somalia. And what we see there is the International Court of Justice has just ruled in favor of Somalia regarding a border row that's going on there. And Kenya has rejected, and this is what they say, sir. Kenya has rejected in totality the decision, and a statement from the presidency has also said the decision was clearly erroneous. Who is right, who is wrong in this case, Prof?
Neither side is right nor wrong. Um, a very wise member of the Supreme Court of a country, forgive me if I don't mention the name of the judge or the name of the country, once said to me, courts don't decide what is right or what is wrong. Courts decide on the basis of the evidence before them what the judgment should be. And let me also give an example from my own official life, both as the Director General of Nigerian Institute of International Affairs and Foreign Minister. When Nigeria had the problem of Bakassi with Cameroons, all attorneys general that I dealt with, all of them had one single advice: don't go to the International Court of Justice. Even if Cameroon goes, don't put in an appearance. And this advice was also underwritten by two ad hoc judges of the International Court of Justice. And that is why the government that I served under, Murtala Mohammed, Obasanjo, Shagari, Ibrahim Babangida, never, I never agreed to go to the International Court of Justice. It was when Abacha became president or head of state, and some lawyers who were not even in international law, they were not authorities on international law, but were close to him and determined to make money by getting the consultancy to defend Nigeria, went to put in an appearance at the International Court of Justice. And of course, you know what happened? Nigeria lost the case. So, given how artificial the boundaries um, um, of Africa are, not drawn by the Africans themselves, but drawn at the Berlin Conference in the 1800s, imprecise, just rough diagrams on the map, with Germany claiming its own, France claiming its own, England claiming it was only the United States that wasn't there, and China. African countries should not go to the International Court of Justice, where the judges sitting there are looking at artificial maps before them and trying to interpret these maps without themselves having knowledge of the intricacies on the ground. So, Africa, Africans wisely, when they became independent, took the decision when the Organization of African Unity was formed, that they will accept the boundaries they inherited. Because if they were to challenge those boundaries, believe me, they knew Africa would be in a series of boundary wars, probably for, I don't know, centuries. And an example is India and Pakistan over Kashmir. I don't know how many wars they fought there and how many wars they will still fight. So Africa decided to live well alone. Obviously, when the issue then of gas and petroleum and fisheries came into the matter, and especially when the concept of the economic exclusive zone came into the matter, issues now became a bit tendentious for several African countries. And each had its point of view, whichever one that was going to be beneficial to its national interest. In this particular case, Somalia wanted that maritime line to be drawn straight down because it will favor it. Kenya wanted that maritime line to be drawn horizontally because that will favor it. What did the International Court of Justice do? They decided to draw the line in the middle. Well, that wasn't a judicial decision. That's a political decision because they couldn't make a judicial decision. So you decide, let's do it that way. The only time you draw a maritime boundary is if two countries are separated by a river, and then you pick not the physical what do you call it now? You don't pick, you don't measure the boundary and decide to draw, 50-50, but to go through what is called the thruMYeyes, which is the middle of the navigable channel, not the middle of the river itself. Is the middle of the navigable channel. That's the only time that you start dividing things. And even then, as I said, the principle is the principle of the thruMYeyes, navigable channel, and not a physical channel. So they shouldn't have gone to court, no matter how long it will have taken to negotiate, to go for arbitration. That's what they should have done. And I would have expected the International Court of Justice to say, go for arbitration, rather than they deciding where the boundaries should be. That Kenya has decided to reject in totality the judgment is not new in the world. There are several countries who have had the ICJ rule against them and who have refused to accept the judgment of the ICJ, the United States being one of them. So it's not just some, funny nations who, have thumped his nose at the International Court of Justice. Big powers have done so. In the judgment the ICJ issued between China and Philippines, China has refused to implement the judgment. So I hope that since the court cannot enforce its own judgment, maybe to go to the Security Council of the United Nations, and the Security Council will, in its wisdom, maybe call for arbitration. But it's a sad day. It's a sad day for Africa, because we don't want another war right now in Africa, not when we are faced with effect of pandemic, we are faced with the issue of environmental degradation, we are faced with, all on our shores. China, Japan, Taiwan are all busy using illegal form of fishing to cut away our fishery resources. Then we want to fight over the little that is now left to us. I don't think it will be in African interest.
There's a question here on YouTube that I want you to respond to, sir. This viewer has said, has there ever been any time in history that the UN has not been biased? And they refer to the use of veto as an illustration.
Good question. Um, Absolutely good question. The United Nations, uh, they, in accepting even the reasoning behind the question, I will still have to say, we can't get the best all the time, and at times the good is the enemy of the best. Uh, United Nations has done creditably good job um, over the decades, where the interests of the superpowers are not in conflict. But the UN has always been a Western dominated institution. Uh, and that is why, if that's one of the conditions that Russia laid down for membership, to have the veto so that it can block any UN action that may be against its interests. But there are occasions, and a smart Secretary General could always define issues in such a way as to block off competing interests of the superpowers and go to the core of a conflict that will save uh, 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 the middle income countries that are in conflict from uh, that conflict further spreading by getting the UN involved. But you are right, or the questioner is right, that the United Nations is the best we have, uh, even though it's not the best that we can have. Mm.
Thank you for that, sir. Let's go to Turkey. And a few weeks ago, we talked about Turkey and Russia and the relationship that seemed to be building there after the summit that they had. But now the Turkish foreign minister has said that Turkey will do whatever is necessary for its security. But surprisingly, Turkey has pointed the finger at Russia and the United States for breaking their promises. How do you explain this situation, Prof?
Well, Turkey finds himself in an area of contentious, competing, and contending interests. Some of these interests are pursued by not nation states, but sub national actors who are beyond the control of any of the states in that area, including Turkey itself. Because don't forget that Turkey also has a subnational actor that has a militia and that has been fighting the central government in Ankara for decades. They also have it. They are present in Syria, present in Iraq, and each one of the not only those who are physically present geographically, in which case, Russia, Iraq, Syria, even Iran, and now Afghanistan, uh, who have just added their own Taliban driven refugees into the pot of stews boiling there. The United States, though globally, geographically far away, but with interests there, they are all there. So, in some areas, Turkey may find itself in alignment with Russia. On other areas, it may find itself, especially since it's a member of NATO, find itself in alignment with the United States. In some other areas, find itself, at odds end with every country except itself. On the Kurdish matter, the Kurds have objectives of their own, which will create which will create problems for almost every, because no country in that area wants an independent Kurdish nation. None. So, and yet, the courts have been useful in fighting ISIS. So it depends now on your own evaluation of to your national interest of the dangers posed by ISIS. If ISIS is if a country perceives ISIS as the main threat to its national interest, it either will look away at whatever the courts are doing. They're good fighters. They know the terrain. They can match ISIS, you know, foot per foot in that area. But if a country thinks, no, ISIS is not our problem, the Kurds are the problem, then any attempt to strengthen the Kurds in their area of control is likely to be perceived as being a threat. And I think this is what is happening to Turkey. Their focus is not on ISIS. The focus of Turkey is on the Kurds. And people who actually welcome the Kurds as allies in fighting ISIS, Turkey will regard as enemies.
We have about 5 minutes left, but I want to put this question to you, and it has to do with Poland. When Brexit started in the United Kingdom, and the people started to mute the idea of the UK leaving, it was almost unthinkable. We thought it would never happen. The people were going to vote, and people were going to vote it down, but it happened. It's now history. But one thing we're now seeing uh, is another test case in Poland, where the courts in Poland have declared Polish law superior to the EU laws. Now that has caused some rioting, some protests. But, sir, do you see Poland getting to a point where they also now start to think of leaving the EU?
Yes, I can foresee that. Um, any first year student of international law will know that Poland is wrong on this matter. You don't belong to a union where your national court will be superior to the court set up by that union, especially on issues that bind together the union. It's an illegal position taken by the Polish court. I can understand it's a political decision. It's not even a legal decision. It's a political decision. You know, again, I think last week or week before, we talked about the making of the new world order omelette. How that omelette is going to turn out, we don't know. But each nation is breaking its own egg. So it will have its own corner of that omelette that it can claim to be its own contribution to this new world order. I suspect that with the issue, with the problems created by Brexit, both for the EU and for England itself, because some of the shenanigans by the Prime Minister of Britain is now coming home to become evident in the question of Northern Ireland and the uh, uh, Good Friday Agreement. Uh, Poland and Hungary there are two who don't. At the beginning of this program, we talked about, various forms of democracy. They are still they are still mentally being influenced by the old Soviet, central control of uh, um, of the political system. They think that, given their own perception of how weak the European Union is now, they can extract some more independence from the EU so they can have a judiciary under their control and some institutions which they had surrendered when they signed the EU treaty, whether they can claw it back. But you cannot cherry pick. If you're a member of a federation or of a union, you cannot cherry pick. You cannot pick what articles you like and what articles you don't like. You signed on to the totality of these articles. Now, as Russia is now also flexing its muscles to try and regain some of its status when it was Soviet Union, may offer Hungary and offer Poland support in order to get them back. That is going to turn a blind eye on what it does with its opposition, how it controls its judiciary, blah, 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 that they don't need to be members of the EU. They are welcome back into the ambit of Russia. If they get that kind of offer and they are not wise enough to see the dangers of accepting that, yes, I can see Poland opting out of but they will regret it. Just as Britain is going to regret Brexit, Poland will regret it.
Thank you very much, sir, for your analysis this evening. And to our viewers, thank you so much for being here. Don't forget, click the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. So anytime we go live, you get the notification. And don't forget to share this. It's just share. You don't need any special permission to share this. Please just go ahead and share this. And as we round up, sir, there is a point that I could not get to today, which I will bring next week. And this has to do with Russia. 2 points about Russia. One is Russia's position that has been described as weaponizing its supply of gas to Europe. And secondly, is the fact that Russia and China were absent, their presidents anyway, were absent from the conversation on Afghanistan and the humanitarian crisis going on in Afghanistan. I'd like to put those two questions to you next week as we start the program. But thank you very much for your time this evening, sir.
Peace.
Goodbye. Goodbye,
Wakanda.
sir. Goodbye to our viewers. See you next week.